the morning discussions, we were the question of soft power kept coming up, and we've touched on various aspects of Russia's soft power in the region, from cultural to religious to economic. So this panel will kind of follow up perhaps on some of the themes that we've already started discussing. And before I introduce our first speaker, I just wanted to be a bit shamelessly self-promotional. This is the latest issue of Europe-Asia Studies, and although it's not on the Balkans, but in order for us to understand Russia's policy in the Balkans, we need to understand the kind of nitty-gritty of Russia's domestic politics. So this special issue that's just come out is on state against civil society in Russia. It's edited by Cameron Ross, and I've got a paper in there as well, but it's a very interesting issue on the latest on domestic politics. So we'll start with our first speaker, Kirill Drezov.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks. I will talk about three groups of issues, and I have to be fairly brief, so a lot will be left for the question time. Now, first I will focus on tales of treachery and brotherhood, or gratitude and betrayal, and then I will look at the discourse of historic debt operated in Russian-Bulgarian relations, and finally, I will talk about the Russia's profile in Bulgaria and Bulgaria's profile in Russia. So when President Putin famously closed down South Stream in December 2014, amongst other things he said, he emphasized one important point that concerned Bulgaria. He argued that EU and NATO do not allow Bulgaria to behave as a sovereign state. And he also emphasized that all Bulgarian politicians have assured him that whatever they may think about other Russian projects in Bulgaria, South Stream, they all see the same as beneficial to Bulgaria. But President Putin's implication was Bulgaria is not allowed to behave as a sovereign state. What happened after this statement is quite instructive. The Russian blogosphere and comment pages of newspapers exploded with comments that largely come to boil down to the same thing. Is Bulgaria has betrayed Russia again. And there were all kinds of qualifications: historical traitor, two betrayals, First and Second World War, and now again. And it is not just anonymous commenters in the Russian blogosphere that were making this point. Just a month and a half before President Putin, a high-ranking Russian official, Dmitry Rogozin, made an interesting point along similar lines when there was information that the Bulgarian Minister of Defense was considering the purchase of Swedish fighter planes instead of Russian ones. Rogozin made the following interesting point. He wrote on his Twitter page, some Shalamanov has convinced Premier Brzezinski so that Bulgaria would yet again betray Russia. Now, this discourse of treachery and betrayal is quite an interesting one, and paradoxically it coexists with another discourse, friendship and brotherhood. It may sound strange, but these are the two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, Bulgarians are traitors, on the other, or would-be traitors. On the other hand, they are sort of brothers. Now, these two things do not really contradict each other, and they coexist in a paradoxical manner. If one looks at the layer of symbolism, or the layers of symbolism between Bulgaria and Russia, the Russian state and President Putin in particular have invested quite a lot in, on this symbolic level. Now, one may make the argument that it's not serious, or conversely that it is the most important thing, but it does exist. Now, the very fact that Putin's 2 official visits to Bulgaria were specifically timed in 2003 and 2008, respectively, to commemorate the 125th and 130th liberation anniversaries of Bulgaria shows that these things are important for him and for people around him. Now, I've started with this black page in Russian-Bulgarian relations, the abandonment of South Stream that was blamed explicitly on Bulgaria, and but only several years before that, things looked much brighter and softer. Right. Now, this puppy, and for dog lovers that are plenty in this country, it would be particularly interesting. This puppy sealed the definite signing up of the South Stream project in 2010. So at that point, Prime Minister Putin was given this puppy of a specific local Bulgarian breed as a present. I'll come to the puppy again, but this goes hand in hand with the serious commemoration stuff that I've already mentioned. I have listed here the the 3 Putin visits, 2 official and 1 business visits to Bulgaria, and the official ones, as I mentioned before, were clearly aligned to celebration of Bulgaria's liberation from the Turks. So the Russian state under Putin is heavily involved in keeping alive the memory of the Russian liberation of Bulgaria from the Ottomans in 1877-78. This goes on through regular celebrations, visits, not just Putin's, and importantly, restoring and building monuments. It must be said that new monuments are being built almost on an annual basis. There are about 400 of them so far, and most of them are actually built by Bulgarians. There is another layer which is more controversial in Bulgaria. I must emphasize that the liberation from the Ottomans, there is a consensus about Russia's positive role, not so concerning the Soviet involvement in Bulgarian affairs around 1944, which paradoxically is no less lavishly commemorated in Bulgaria. So, some images of these monuments. Now, on top you can see the Tsar Liberator that faces the Bulgarian parliament, a very important monument. Interestingly enough, there were about 2,000 monuments to Alexander II in Russia itself, and they were all pulled down by the Bolsheviks, by the communists, in the 1920s and 30s. The only 2 surviving monuments to Alexander II, to the Tsar Liberator, are on Senate Square in Helsinki and on Parliament Square in Sofia. And again, if you look at the at this page, at this picture here, that one, the leftmost picture on the top, I think unfortunately part of the description is not visible, but it says, "To the Tsar Liberator from grateful Bulgaria." So gratitude is that. And in communist times, it actually said something else. It said, "To the brothers liberators from grateful Bulgaria." So it reverted twice. So it was to the Tsar, then to the brothers, then back to the Tsar. And if you look carefully at the monument, you'll see that it took some effort to actually change the inscription. Now further down, this is the Shipka Memorial, and this is the Shipka Monastery. This Shipka Memorial was built in 1934, actually. And very interestingly, the Soviet the Soviet state was not involved. It was built as a joint commemoration of Tsarist Russia, represented by the white emigres, and Tsarist Bulgaria in 1934. And then this is the monastery Shipka. That's the biggest cathedral in Sofia, which is again Bulgarian built Saint Alexander Nevsky, the patron saint of Alexander II. And on and on. I would not bother you with all of this. Now, 400, as I said, 400 monuments, 2 cities, plenty of villages named after Russians, Russian generals of the period, plenty of streets. You go around Sofia and you see these streets left, right, and center. So everything is very well commemorated. Now, the Soviet layer. Now, again, what I want to emphasize is that most of these hundreds of Soviet commemoration, Soviet memorials in Bulgaria do not actually commemorate any particular battles. The Soviet army did not lose any soldiers in battle in Bulgaria. The only really war-related memorials out of these hundreds is actually 3. This one here and the other 2 there. People who died of their wounds on Bulgarian soil. So only 3 are really war memorials. Anyway, the important thing to remember in this case is that it is very hard for Bulgarians to forget about Russia's role in the liberation from the Turks, or the Soviet role in defeating Nazi Germany, however much that might concern Bulgaria. It's everywhere around them, in either memorials or in street names and all that. Now, one thing that Bulgarian politicians or intellectuals have tried meekly to assert, to play the same historic debt game with Russia, is also to make some claims that Russia has a historic debt to Bulgaria. Now, the debate that follows out of this is like when you see it played again and again in the blogosphere, is when Russians make the claim, without us, you would have ended up like the Kurds, or even worse, like the Armenians, i.e. nowhere. And then the Bulgarians would retort, without us, without you importing our alphabet and our language, you would not have been the Russian nation that exists before, that exists today. So this, of course, kind of dialogue leads nowhere. But that's the kind of historic debt game that is being played. The problem, again, is that the Bulgarians are in a very weak position in this respect. The Russian contribution is everywhere to be seen in Bulgaria, not so with the Bulgarian contribution. Unless you are a student in a Russian seminary, you wouldn't know names from the 10th century like Konstantin Preslavsky or Ioan Exarch. These are not really household names in Russia. They are studied, of course, in Russian Orthodox seminaries. So as far as the theologians are concerned, a small group of linguists, some literary specialists, these people are aware of Russian-Bulgarian links in the early medieval times and do make points of, well, they do write about their appreciation of Bulgaria's contribution. The Russian public, of course, is blissfully unaware of that. So you often get lectured about that you're writing in our letters, or you're speaking our language and all that, which, of course, leaves lifelong impressions on young Bulgarians in particular. Now, 2 politicians have, over the last 25 years, made some effort to meet Bulgarian expectations of historic debt. Russia's historic debt to Bulgaria. In 1992, Boris Yeltsin, on his first official visit to Sofia, noted that ancient Rus has borrowed from Bulgaria the Slavonic alphabet presented to the world by the Holy Brothers Cyril and Methodius, very careful wording. And then in 2012, not surprisingly, Patriarch Kirill, when he was visiting Bulgaria, also emphasized that the Bulgarian church, the most ancient among Slavonic churches, has sent priests and books to Kiev and Rus, which were the first holy text of the newly christened Russian people. And that's about it. Now, the heyday of Russian-Bulgarian relations was in November 2010. I think it is worth looking at these pictures because they tell a lot. Now, on top, the Russian premier is meeting his Bulgarian counterpart, respectively Borisov on the left and Putin on the right. On the right, the Russian premier is meeting the Bulgarian president, a staunch pro-Russian politician, also he was considered. But look at the bottom. This is Premier Putin looking at the relics of St. John the Baptist. Now, there's a big controversy, are they really the relics of St. John the Baptist? But they were discovered conveniently just, well, not connected with Putin, but not long ago before his visit in Sozopol. Sorry, no, it's nothing to do with Putin. He was just someone who really showed a deep interest in that, as you can see here. And that's Putin meeting the Bulgarian Patriarch of that time, someone who at that point was 96 years old, and the oldest living Orthodox Patriarch. So you can see that it's not just oil and gas. It is something that has other symbolic layers. The orthodoxy very clearly looms large, at least on a symbolic level. Now, in 2012, April 2012, the Russian Patriarch Kirill made his first visit abroad to visit his Orthodox counterpart in Bulgaria. And this was a breach of protocol, incidentally, because by protocol, the Russian Patriarch has to go first to the ancient patriarchs, to Alexandria, to Constantinople, of course. With Constantinople, the relations are not terribly good, but Alexandria and Jerusalem is another matter. But he made the visit to Bulgaria, and it was explained at that point that the Bulgarian Patriarch is very old, and he has to kind of respect his age seniority. Anyway, again, it was not just a patriarch to patriarch. You can see that the Russian Patriarch met the Prime Minister again and the President there. So there we are. The symbolic level is well mobilized and well established. But sadly, things didn't go according to plan, something that started with much fanfare. I'm going back to the dock and just drawing your attention to some of the comments in 2010. Okay, so Kommersant Daily commented Bulgaria doggedly attached to South Stream. EU inside leg-to-leg diplomacy or four-port diplomacy. The BBC, Bulgarian puppy seals gas deal with Russian Prime Minister. Puppy diplomacy errative. And there was a hit, actually, a song by Murzelki International, Just Give the PM a Puppy. A really impressive song that actually plays on another symbolic link between Bulgaria and Russia, the Russian singer Philip Kirkorov, who by origin is from Bulgaria. So, alas, everything that was left in the end of this historic 2010 visit was the puppy, which is now a big dog, and you can see that it has fared far better than the South Stream project. And it's one of President Putin's 3 beloved dogs. And with this, I will conclude, and I hope more will come in conversations, in question time.
Thank you. Thank you. We now have Yelena Milic from the Center for Euro-Atlantic Studies.
Thank you. Let me first extend my gratitude to the organizer for inviting me here. It's really a privilege to address such a prominent audience and to speak at such a good event. I hope I'll rise up to your expectations, because most of what I have planned to say about connection between Serbia and Russia has already been mentioned, but nevertheless, I'll continue with some pictures, narrative ones though, which at a bigger scale of things may seem irrelevant, but I find them very useful for the understanding of what's going on between Serbia and Russia these days. I will then jump very briefly to breakdown of most relevant accounts in history of Serbia and Russia relationships, simply to highlight this message that there is not that much, as many want to present. Then I will give you a few examples on what's going on these days, how Russian soft power is hitting heavily Serbian democratization and EU processes, and I'll try to explain why. I will then mention a few unrelated maybe trends in Serbia, but which are in very misfortunate synergy with Russian influence increasing in Serbia, and then I'll dare to give some recommendations how to move on from current situation, which is not good. As Mr. Bechev mentioned earlier this morning, Belgrade yesterday commemorated the 12th anniversary of the assassination of our reform Prime Minister, Mr. Zoran Đinđić. Back in 2008, when Kosovo declared independence, huge rallies were organized in Belgrade against that. And the guy from the Russian TV station called Russia, Konstantin Semyonov, reporting from that event, said, he somehow mentioned Prime Minister Đinđić, and he said he got it coming, he deserved to be killed, he is the one who came on the wing of the Western support, and he, took away and shifted Serbia towards this, decaying and amoral West, etc., etc. Serbian authorities at the time, and sorry, Dusan, for that, sent a very weak note to Russian officials, to which Mr. Lavrov, I think, promised to see that these journalists would be sacked from his post. Unfortunately, I cross-checked before I came here, actually cross-checked for the purpose of the anniversary. The guy is, of course, live and kicking. He is reporting for Russia 24 TV channel now. He has his own talk show these days, and he's promoting Russian propaganda. Fast forward to present time. Serbian ruling party MPs were observing illicit election in Luhansk recently. They were never punished or even warned by their party leader, who is accidentally also Serbian Prime Minister. Another MP from the Serbian ruling party has been recently sitting in Serbian parliament with the flag of runaway Donetsk Republic, for example. Some more of them justify that actions, find them just normal. The third short story that I would like to mention is that there is a political association. It's still not verified as a political party called the Third Serbia, who has been also maintaining close contacts with rebels in eastern Ukraine, paying visits, etc. They are also visiting MPs in Russian Duma and had made a huge story on Russian TV station about those in Serbia who were leaders of non-violent movement Otpor, which actually helped a lot toppling of Milosevic regime. And they accused a leader of that movement and some others close to him, included in a wider extent, of planning to destabilize Serbia, to organize putsch in Serbia, and to affect some, and maybe try to attack some of the Russian property in Serbia, I think referring to Gazprom headquarters in Vojvodina. The Third Serbia political movement is coalitional partner of the leading Serbian government political party led by Mr. Vučić in the city of Novi Sad, by the way. So these are these three small, irrelevant, maybe at the greater scope of things, stories or pictures, but I find them pretty relevant. I would now like to give you a very, very short breakdown on some of the most important relationships between Serbia and Russia in the last 200, 250 years, just to demonstrate that there is really no room to go so easily and to take for granted that everyone is, doing these days, including EU officials and some others who are actually, shaping, or influencing Serbian affairs. That, of course, there is this traditional tie between Russia and Serbia, and this is why we have to cut Serbian leadership some slack. Well, back in 1903, the rebels, and uncontrolled parts of at that time Serbian army killed our king and our queen, and many at that time were appalled with the way they did it and why they did it and how they actually were trying to overtake Serbia at the time, and we were asking for help, Russia at the time, which didn't help the more progressive parts of Serbia at all. Then, fast forward, Second World War, apparently Russians liberated Belgrade. Yes, they did, but there are many stories which you can't hear in the mainstream narrative, is that there were many rapings and many lootings, and that there are many anti-Red Army sentiment among those who were victims of these accounts. Then you all are aware that during Tito's time, Serbia actually was not part of the Warsaw Pact. There are many distinctions between former Republic of Yugoslavia at the time, the way we lived, and people living under the Soviet bloc. Again, fast forward to after the October the 5th events, at that time, Prime Minister Đinđić was moving Serbia towards more democracy, towards rule of law, more towards EU, his links with Russia were not that strong. He was more even dragged in by the Western partners. As you have heard, some Russians, were happy for him to be killed, and there was no condemnation of what this guy had said. So there is no room to say that ties are so strong. During Tito's time, the main foreign languages that were taught in our schools were English and German, not Russian. Serbian public was much more, even Yugoslav public, were much more open, to cultural influences coming from the West, and even these days it is the case. So why is this narrative different from historical facts? And who is creating this self-fulfilling prophecy? Both sides are doing it for their own reasons. Russian officials are very keen, and they are mainstream media and in Serbia to continue with this self-fulfilling prophecy. I think that the reason they are after Serbia is not our strategic position or some other issues that actually many tend to forget. That before this colored revolution in Ukraine, in Georgia, in Tunisia, there was actually the most successful one during the October 5th, when we toppled Milosevic in Serbia. And Mr. Đinđić was a symbol of that one. And if you compare where is Serbia today, luckily, in comparison to Ukraine and Georgia, we are a country which is EU candidate for EU membership, and we are a country which has just recently agreed individual partnership action plan with NATO, which are all good news, we are actually, this example of the success of this approach of, dismantling authoritarian regime and moving towards more democratic and hopefully EU membership kind of a state, I think that a current Russian regime fears, to me, ununderstandable level, this soft power of the West, and is trying to undermine effects in Serbia in order to show to their citizenship that EU accession and soft power effects are not that alluring, as that successful for their own domestic audience, because of the fear that these kind of things can happen in Moscow and elsewhere. They are fully aware that it is in a way easier than to go in a direct armed confrontation, which everyone is luckily avoiding still. So I think that this is the main reason why Russia is increasing its influence in Serbia. I will speak further on how that influence is penetrating, or how it is articulated. Why it falls on a very fruitful soil in Serbia. We have heard recently from our ambassador to the United Kingdom that most of our MPs and all political parties in our parliament are pro-EU oriented. And yes, this is a precedent. Unfortunately, the popular support for the EU integration last summer, back in 2014, at one point dropped even below 50%. And I think that there was some emergency additional polling organized by EU, you know, to say that that is not the case. But there is some kind of discrepancy, you know, with those two data. It must be that among the ruling structures, there are a lot of those, you know, who are actually just paying lip service to the EU integration, knowing that this is what keeps them in power, while deep down they have some kind of concerns. Because many of us who didn't vote or who are in opposition are actually those who were, you know, pro-EU oriented all these years. So that tells you something about how schizophrenic situation in Serbia is. It doesn't fall that much on the fruitful soil because Russians are playing these orthodoxy or Slavic bond cards, you know. Slavic bond, pan-Slavism in Serbia and among Serbian nationalists, and it's still predominant feeling, is always linked with project of Yugoslavia, which Serbia actually didn't like that much. Orthodoxy, we were never big churchgoers, and there are other Orthodox countries, you know, and Orthodox communities throughout the world. So the bond which they are pressing most, and it was very rightly pointed earlier today, is this bond of us being victims of the West. This is the string that really you can play in Serbia with good reasons and with bad reasons, or with or without grounds. And this is the one that also resonates well in Serbia. There is also a problem that many of those who were very vigorously against nationalistic, aggressive adventures of the Serbian leadership in the 90s, who were against war in Bosnia and in Croatia, and were very much in favor of this democratic consolidation, are these days almost anti-globalists, totally disappointed in the West, and are not, you know, that we are missing the liberal center in Serbia these days, unfortunately. So these are all the reasons why Russian narrative falls on the fruitful soil in Serbia, and why their influence is high. And then there is another trend. There are two big centers of resistance to Serbian EU integration which use connection with Russia, this augmented influence and relevance that allegedly Russia has, to cover their genuine reasons why they don't want to see Serbia moving towards the EU. The first one is the sphere of business and economy, not necessarily out of Serbian government. I dare say, actually, some of them are in a very inner cycle of prime minister. They know very well that moving towards the EU, we'll have to honor our Stabilization Association agreement provisions that demand more transparency in tendering procedures, that, you know, to cut the story short, we shall have more equal opportunities for businesses to go on in a leveled field with some mechanisms to crack monopolies, control state subsidies, you know, reduce the number of state dealings, you know, direct contracts state by state, which, you know, then implies some lack of transparency, etc. And of course, they are going to lose their privileges and monopolies that they have gained, and they can say openly, I don't want that because, you know, and then they say, oh, but we can't move towards the EU because we are betraying Russia. They're using this fake relevance that Russia has as a front. The other center of resistance in the security sector, and many of them very well know what they've been doing back in the 90s, particularly with a relationship to what was going on in Kosovo, because these are the trials in front of the domestic courts that are still missing, and they assume that getting closer to the EU would assume also more demands from the EU for the trials in front of domestic courts. Ultimately, we'll have to face the role even of our top military leadership in a connection with their troops being in a field in which part of Kosovo in which most of the civilians of the Albanian origin were killed, and their bodies are popping up in mass graves in secondary locations in Serbia. So, of course, they also can say we don't want to go closer to the EU because there would be more trials and more, demands for the transitional justice, and then use Russia as a front. So, how to overcome that? It's not easy. Maybe what I have said to you is not that much, and maybe some would say, but that is not that big, this is happening elsewhere. But when Putin visits Austria, it's not the same, or when they cut the deal, South Stream there, it does not shake Austrian political system. These kind of things, happening in Serbia are, undermining Serbian progress towards the EU. And they are using this perverted a narrative about US and EU soft power in terms of financing NGOs, etc., and sending media outlets. They are using this perverted narrative of making comparison between Crimea and Kosovo, again neglecting huge amount of civilians being killed by Serbian forces, etc., which we didn't see in Crimea, for example. They are using also these Orthodox Church bonds now. Serbian Orthodox Church was always not more progressive than the Russian Orthodox Church, but they were pretty different. Serbian bishops were not dealing with day-to-day businesses, were not, they didn't have attitude on abortion, or were not pressing society to accept their values that much, but they got the card, wild card to deal more with day-to-day businesses for their silence or for not being very strong against the Brussels Agreement, for example. Another avenue that Russians are pursuing successfully is, increased cooperation with educational institutions. For example, Belgrade University faculties are giving them premises to bring Russian Institute for Strategic Studies speakers. Reshetnikov is, for example, now very popular in Serbia. He can have events in Belgrade University whenever he wants. I doubt that NGOs who would try to bring prominent speakers from the political West would have that easily access to organize events at any of the, halls at the Belgrade University. They are, of course, I don't know whether it fits to this narrative of soft power or not, are demanding more and more cooperation in the defense structure. There is this important story about alleged humanitarian center in Niš, which I think can be called humanitarian center for many reasons, and is actually the hub for the Russian intelligence operation in the region, which nobody wants openly to say, so I'll do it. So they are really pursuing many avenues. Since recently we've got a Sputnik program, Russia Today, tailor-made for Serbia, translated in Serbia. It is an internet portal, and they broadcast their news 3 times on one very popular radio station in Serbia. Why? Because Serbia also had 2 dailies which were very much in favor of Putin all these years. I think because they see Belgrade as a hub to continue, their influence and to spread their influence to Republika Srpska and Montenegro as well, and North Kosovo in particular. In North Kosovo, they are very good in setting up NGOs, formerly Serbian NGOs of Serbs in North Kosovo, who are very, very keen of undermining implementation of the Brussels Agreement. Their activists are very against setup of the Association of these Serbian municipalities in Kosovo, etc., etc. As you know, in Bosnia, they are rolling in money in those 2 crude oil refineries, which are not business profitable companies, but they are just sheer assistance to Mr. Dodik's reign in Republika Srpska. Yes, Republika Srpska can't run away from its environment, even if it declares independence, but it's enough to undermine, any reshuffle in the constitutional or other political arrangements in Bosnia. We can help Bosnia move along towards the EU and NATO integration, and that's enough for them at this point, I would say. In Montenegro, I have had an opportunity to attend several pro-anti-NATO debates last summer. I don't shy away from anti-NATO debates in Serbia at all, but Russians are funding, there are those who are not against NATO, but they are promoting pro-Putin propaganda. They're not even talking against NATO, they're talking about against, you know, Western civilization and many other things. They don't, you know, say membership is expensive or we can be neutral. No, they are directly going, promoting Putin propaganda, justifying his actions, etc., etc. So how to contain that? No quick fixes, I never offered them. To me, it is very important for the EU to help Serbia reform its security structures as well, because they are the ones who can be easily abused to push those who are pushing pro-Russian and anti-EU rhetorics in this country, to close that gap, to close these gaps which provide for too many monopolies, state subsidies, and chop shops of the public companies. And then ultimately, because our pro-EU opposition is infringes, to direct Mr. Vučić, to help him realize some of the reforms and stories that he is telling to the Westerners, you know, to maybe act upon his words as well. At the moment, I think that would be the best way to force him towards the EU integration, to assist him to fulfill some of these reforms, which would strengthen, you know, the independent judiciary in Serbia as well, which I think then would reduce this maneuver space that Russians are using in Serbia at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. We now give the word to our final speaker, Dusan Spasojevic, who is a diplomat and politician and also an LSEE alumnus.
Thank you very much. At the very beginning, want to thank very much to Otton, James, and Dimitar for extending an invitation. It's always a pleasure coming back here at the LSEE. I will, you know, try to keep to the 10 minutes so that we can have a debate after, and I will try to explain Russian soft power in the Balkans from my, my personal perspective. I have worked for the government and in the government for 13 years after 2000, and this will be a very personalized account, I think pretty credible and as objective as possible. I would like to start off with a very famous quote that says, "I cannot forecast to you the actions of Russia. It is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. But perhaps there is a key. That key is Russian national interest. It cannot be in accordance with the interest of the safety of Russia that Germany should plant itself upon the shores of the Black Sea, or that it should overrun the Balkan states and subjugate the Slavonic peoples of the southeastern Europe. That would be contrary to the historic life interests of Russia." I strongly doubt that any British Prime Minister today will stand on this position of Winston Churchill some 70 years ago, but this is the best proof that in international politics perceptions change and the positions change. And this picture that we have above, four of us, is in a way very much a thank to Mr. Churchill, because Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin allowed Soviet troops to liberate Belgrade in October 1944. So this is the picture of the 70th anniversary. Mr. Putin basically, and the Serbian president celebrating the liberation of Belgrade from the Nazi rule in 1944. Historical perspective of the soft power is very hard, if not impossible to give, because a notion of soft power did not really exist until modern era, not certainly in the 19th century where everything was about military might and the money. And my basic position is that Russia in the Balkans, or Russian soft power in the Balkans, is very much an interactive notion, and it very much depends on the position of other players in our area. The players have changed through the history. It was the Ottomans for a very long time, too long. Then there were Austro-Hungarians. There were always the British, and of course there were always the Russians. And there were many ups and downs in the Serbian and Russian relationship, like my predecessor has rightly said. In the 19th century, Russia was very much supporting the national liberation movements all through the Balkans, but also Serbs are to thank to Imperial Russia to two very negative factors that were the consequence of Russian deliberations. That was the Bulgarian and Russian Bulgarian-Serbian antagonism, are something that Russia back in the 1870s very much supported. Montenegrin separatism in that time was also very much backed by the Russian Empire. Then in the 20th century, we had glorious moments in the Great War when Russia, until 1917 and the revolution, was the ally not only of Serbia but of all the other winning countries that were on the winning side. But Serbia and Russia did not have a diplomatic relationship from, I think, 1917 up to 1940. Then the Soviet Union and the Comintern was doing everything to undermine the Serbian hegemony that was lived through the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, and then from 1929 on in Yugoslavia. Also, even though President Tito was somebody who was spent years in Moscow and was, some claimed, the agent of Comintern, he broke off relationship with the Soviet Union in a very dangerous times in 1948. To come to the modern era, and the perception of Russia was among the populace of Serbia very, I dare say, people were disappointed in Russia in 1990s in Serbia because Russia did nothing to help the Serbian cause. Russia voted in the Security Council for every single packet of sanctions imposed upon Serbia and Montenegro, upon Yugoslavia. In 1999, during the NATO bombing, Russia did not come out and help. And from 2000 on, the Serbian elite, the people, that the ring of people where I belong to, basically Western orientated, did not count on Russia at all from 2000 on. Milosevic fell, the new democratic government was formed, completely pro-Western, and with great expectations. It took Serbia 3 years and the prime minister to be shot, on 12 years ago, on yesterday's day, to be admitted to the Council of Europe. 3 years after Milosevic was gone. Serbia, in 2001, 2, and 3, had Euro-Atlantic integrations as its official government policy. It took Serbia 5 years to become a member of the Partnership for Peace. Serbia was heavily opposed to join Partnership for Peace by United States, Germany, France, and Britain, the biggest powers within NATO, and only after National Security Advisor to the then President of the United States, George Bush, Stephen Hadley, was persuaded by some Serbian officials that Serbia should be admitted. He then persuaded the president on a flight from Washington to Riga, and Serbia became the member of the PFP. We should also remind ourselves that Serbian government, led by Prime Minister Koštunica, in September 2006 officially adopted a decision to send troops to Afghanistan. That was as late as 2006. And then comes Kosovo affair. And all of this is simply moved out from the public scene, and Russia, which did not exist as a factor in the Serbian politics, rightly or wrongly. Even the late Prime Minister Đinđić, in his last interview, shown the signs of desperation and halfly admitting that Serbia was maybe over too optimistic with looking for a helping hand from the West. Then comes the unilateral declaration of independence of Kosovo, and everything in Serbian politics becomes very understandably, from my point of view, obsessed with this issue. We are becoming, in internal politics and in foreign policy, one issue country. Everything was about Kosovo and how to stop Kosovo unilateral declaration of independence receiving less recognition, and everything was in politics was fighting it. And here comes the Russian. Here comes Russia, and here comes Russia's support. Is it for the self-interested reasons? Is it for defending the international law? It is irrelevant. Russia was the power that came in 2008, entered the Serbian politics. I was, at the time, working as an advisor to the President of the Republic, and I took part in Vienna talks as a junior member of the Serbian delegation. And I would not be too wrong if I say that Russia threatening a veto in the Security Council surprised not only us, it surprised everybody, including the Western negotiators. Nobody expected that Russia will come forward so staunchly, very strongly against it. And this is when Serbia adopts the declaration on Kosovo in December 2007. It is a parliamentary declaration on Kosovo where it says that it will be militarily neutral. This is when a year later Russia buys the biggest oil company in Serbia that produces, somebody said today, 17% of our GDP. The Serbian democratic elite felt humiliated by the West. It was very hard because, what we promised to the people, once Milosevic is gone, the attitude of our friends in the West will completely change and Serbia will be embraced. And then it was very hard to explain to the people who vote in the elections how come Milosevic was respected better than the democratic government. Because Milosevic, in the time of a weak Russian President Yeltsin, Milosevic received Resolution 1244, which says that Kosovo is part of Serbia. And then 8 years after, when you have anti-communist Democrats in power in Belgrade, Kosovo declares unilateral declaration of independence, and it is embraced by Serbian Western allies. And my theory is that it is not very much Russian soft power, how much is that Russia recognized the weakness, the breach in the Serbian-Western relationship, and naturally, as anybody else will do it, exploited it as an advantage and became a factor in Serbian politics. Nevertheless, Russian soft power, we can debate later on where it comes from. Jelena has mentioned certain NGOs. It was, for example, I'll give you an example. When the American vice president came to visit Serbia I think in May 2009, he was hosted by the Serbian military. When the Russian president of the day, Dmitry Medvedev, came to visit Serbia, he was hosted by the Serbian Orthodox Church. Back in 1944, and I'm again referring to this picture, which is a celebration of the 70 years of liberation from Nazis, Russian Soviet troops were hosted by the military, and the Serbian Orthodox Church was the victim of the communist regime that was imposed by the Soviet Union under the deal of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin in Yalta. So it is all very complex, which internal forces are part of the soft power of the West or of the East. It is very hard to tell. You would expect that the Serbian military, who were in war with NATO in 1999, will be the staunchest opposition to the Euro-Atlantic integration of Serbia, which is not the case. They're professionally not politicized, but I spent 4 years in the military, and I'd say they're more keen than the rest of society on Euro-Atlantic integration. File and rank, I'm speaking. But the crux is European Union does not have alternative in Serbian politics. It is not only the 250 MPs in the parliament. It is very odd that you don't have any opposition. You have it in this country, you have it in Germany, you have it in France, MPs who are Eurosceptic at least. In Serbia, you don't have a single one, and in that sense, Russian soft power cannot be a spoiler in this game. Russian soft power is not a threat to the Serbian full membership of the European Union. I don't see it. It's a kind Serbian-Russian relationship as perceived by both government and opposition in Belgrade is a supplement to this strategic goal of becoming a full member of the EU. It's French will call it ménage à trois. Not everybody looks at this with the same eyes to, in this relationship of three, but Serbian elite thinks it is possible and that it is beneficial to Serbia.
We will gather some questions, but we will have to be very brief. So I'll start with the gentleman here.
Thank you very much to all these panelists in the final session. A particularly interesting expositions by Ms. Milic and Mr. Spasojevic on Serb-Russian relations from different perspectives. My question concerns Russia, Serbia, EU. Now, even today, and amongst the speakers, we've heard two diametrically opposed views on this. One view says that Russia is very intent on stopping Serbia's integration and, providing an alternative and doing all it can to derail this. The other view is that Russia's perfectly content with Serbia to become a member of the EU because, again, the Trojan horse argument. So which is it? And when you give your answer, give us the reasons for it. And as a supplement to that question, whatever the view, Russian view vis-a-vis the EU, I think it's fair to say that they are adamantly opposed to Serbia's membership of NATO. So even if they are willing to support or tolerate at the least Serbia's integration in the EU, there remains the fact that they are, I think, adamantly opposed to the NATO issue. Thank you.
I've got a question for Kirill, but let me preface it by an observation that Jelena said that Russian was not readily accessible and it's not a popular language, which is really easy to contrast with Bulgaria, where even the hard Russophobes or hawkish people read Russian websites on a regular basis. In Serbia, by contrast, pro-Russians don't have this kind of referential framework. But my question really is about the third one, in a way, in between Serbia and Bulgaria. That's the case of Macedonia. I know you've worked quite a bit on Macedonian politics. Now, what you see with Gruevski is, and people close to him in the public sphere, is a fascination with Putin. In your opinion, what is the reason for this sudden discovery of Russia and this fascination lately in Skopje?
One more question. Sorry?
Misha Gavrilovic. I'm a citizen of the United Kingdom, but Belgrade born. So I also follow what has been happening there. We've heard a very balanced view on Bulgarian and Russian relationships, brotherhood and unity, and Bulgaria kind of betrays Russia. But from Jelena Milic, we have heard everything that was anti-Russian. Some of us might say it was anti-Serbian. You use the word we. I presume by that you spoke for the Euro-Atlantic Studies Group, but I got the impression that you felt you were speaking on behalf of Serbia. I don't think many people would agree with you. There is a basic difference here with Serbia and Russia. The western parts, the Euro-Atlantic, NATO, has dropped 23,000 tons of bombs on Serbia. Schools have been bombed, hospitals have been bombed. The central television station in the middle of Belgrade, the building was pulverized and 16 media workers were murdered inside it. By contrast, Russia hasn't dropped a single bomb on the Balkans. It hasn't dropped a single bomb on the Crimea. As far as I know, it hasn't dropped a single bomb on the Ukraine, also some people claim so. I'm sorry, but we have to, if we are going to have this group, a question, however, just a major question now. We hear how keen these 250 representatives are keen on the European Union. But there is a business question. How keen, can you tell us, is the European Union on Serbian membership? What benefits does the European Union expect from Serbia?
So
That's the question.
We'll let the three panelists answer the question.
Coming back to just one question. Why do you live in a NATO state? Why did you accept the citizenship of a NATO state when you despise it so much? I wouldn't if I'm you.
Sorry,
anyway, coming back to Mr. Kekic's questions, I deliberately skipped the role of Russia in Kosovo status settlement and the role of Dušan's government. That one, waiting to see what he would say first. I have slightly different, of course, position on that one as well, and I'll explain. First of all, we have to understand that we managed to topple Milosevic basically on, at that time, democratic opposition of Serbia alliance, criticizing his lack of political freedoms in Serbia and his poor economical performances, not pushing that much for what he was doing in Kosovo, in Bosnia and in Croatia. Don't forget that actually Koštunica was the one who formally won, and defeated Milosevic, and he was the one for sure who was not heavy on any of these wrongdoings of Milosevic, Serbia in the region. Mr. Đinđić became actually the reform leader at one point, also because he was fulfilling, luckily, the conditionality policy of the West to normalize Serbia. And I wouldn't say that, NATO failed to accept us immediately in the partnership for peace. We still did not arrest at that time Mladić and Karadzic, and they were hidden by our army, you know. Yes, we toppled Milosevic, but we didn't get rid of his system, and some of the wrongdoings, you know, towards the region couldn't be erased simply by, you know, getting new democratic government, like, you know, what happened in Kosovo, or whether we had to cooperate with the ICTY, etc. So I think that actually the democratic government of that time had some unrealistic expectation about the outcome of the future status of Kosovo. And it was not that Russia came because we were disappointed with the West. I think that we were, by our government at that time, told some unrealistic expectations, and actually put too many baskets too many eggs in one basket, sorry. So, you know, Russians are behaving like, okay, we are going to offer you an assistance whether you don't need it or not. But it seems to me that in terms of this particular first round of negotiation with Kosovo, we made a mistake and invited them as well. And this is why also we gave an ease for only for 100 million euros, and for not stipulating one single provision in the contract what would happen if Russians failed to deliver on the South Stream, which actually did happen at the end of the day. We also, I think, you know, overpaid for Putin's political support for Mr. Tadic to run himself for the president again. So I have, as I have said, slightly different attitude on that one. And I deliberately mentioned some of the things that are happening these days with regard of what's going on in Serbia, because even in the ruling party and about our prime minister, I think that, you know, the jury is still out whether he wants to leave Serbia towards the West, or whether he wants actually to create a country which is not like Russia because it's too big, but, you know, Southeast Asia, you know, or these Gulf countries with high rises, and he narrows down modernization to good infrastructure and big buildings. Very keen to crack on opposition, to crack on media freedoms, to undermine human rights issues, division of power. So there is this unfortunate process of Putinization in Serbia as well, you know, which is funny because apparently we are moving towards EU as well. And I think that now this is where I blame the West, is that they have been for far too long turning blind eye to many undemocratic trends of this government, as long as it was allegedly delivering on Brussels agreement. But it's not a normalization of relationship with Kosovo, because our president, you know, stood immediately to protect chief of staff, which even the previous government protected as well, despite very, very well-founded allegation that his troops did a bunch of wrongdoings in Kosovo, and it's simply immoral, not to say not logical, to have such a chief of staff on the top of our army if you want genuine normalization of relationship with Kosovo. Sorry. There are other trends, you know, very similar patterns of behavior of Prime Minister Vučić as of Putin, you know, in Russia, in how he handles some other affairs, including, you know, this trial against this controversial businessman Mišković. But believe me, this trial and the indictment and procedural breaches are even much more controversial than ever his role was in Serbian economy, so to say, an privatization for whatever he's charged at the moment. So I think all these, you know, I didn't say that Russia is doing everything. It's not that much in comparison to what I suppose they are allocating elsewhere in the world where they have different and more bigger interests, but is enough to shake and undermine Serbian progress towards the EU. Let me just conclude this intervention with the fact that each single Russian official is using solely words like EU is blackmailing Serbia, you are solely responsible what happened to South Stream. We had nothing to do with the failure of the South Stream. Bulgarians stabbed you in your back. The EU stabbed you in your back. And unfortunately, the predominance narrative of Serbian leadership, when they justify some of the actions formally towards the EU, is, yes, we had to, we were forced to, but, you know, because of the circumstances, because, you know, we had to. So this is not a good narrative if we are genuinely going towards the EU.
Oh, on Macedonia. Yeah, Dimos question. Well, I think Russia's kind of anti-Western disposition gives succor to all those politicians that are not particularly happy with the European Union. And in this respect, the year 2014-15 is very different from the year 2000, for example. After the, in a way, what happened in Kosovo extinguished any hope for a while of a serious Russian role in the Balkans. In the year 2000, the Bulgarian Socialist Party, the successor to the Communist Party, historically changed its position in favor of a NATO alliance, and at the BSP Congress at the time, conference at the time, a leading BSP politician explained it very succinctly. If we do not join NATO, NATO would come to us. You either go to NATO or NATO comes to you. That was the alternative in the perceptions of the BSP politicians in 2011. Now it is not the case. Now it's in a way because there is this confrontation in Ukraine, because Russia is building up a Eurasian Union. Why not Gruevski, who is being shunned by the European Union for his kind of approach to governance? He might express some admiration with Russia or with Putin or whatever. But again, Macedonia is very much a former Yugoslav republic. So what has been said here about Serbia, goes to explains a great deal to what's happening in Macedonia. There is very little knowledge of Russian amongst Macedonian politicians. Well, next to none. And I can count on the fingers of one hand Macedonian literary figures that actually have some interest in Russian culture or whatever. The Russian Orthodox Church actually in Macedonia doesn't have a particularly good image for obvious reasons. But another thing, apart from the particular way Gruevski deals with governance and kind of dominates Macedonian politics and marginalizes the opposition, another thing that also works in favor of Russia in Macedonia is that, by and large, the Macedonian public takes a very cynical view of power politics. Basically, might is right. If you have might, you throw it around. Russia is no different from anyone else, and we're quite impressed with what the Russians are doing. So Russia's kind of prestige in Macedonia, I think, has actually grown with what Russia has done in Ukraine, paradoxically, perhaps for these reasons. And just one small comment on to what Mr. Gavrilovic was mentioned about this, brotherhood betrayal kind of narrative in Bulgaria. I don't particularly like this narrative. I think it kind of simplifies, mythologizes, and all kinds of things. But what is very interesting in the Bulgarian case, compared especially with what you heard now about Serbia, is that ups and downs in Bulgarian-Russian relations do not generate much passion in Bulgaria. And perhaps for reasons that Bulgarians, in a way, Bulgarian-Russian relations have seen far greater extremes than Russian-Serbian relations. Bulgaria has been at the shooting war with Russia in the First World War. Bulgaria has suffered a 3 years Russian occupation, a Soviet occupation actually, a very onerous occupation. It has actually undergone very extensive integration with the Soviet Union, unparalleled not only in Serbia but anywhere in the Eastern Bloc, and so it's a far more varied experience, which basically leads to kind of it's exemplified by Borisov's or top Bulgarian politicians' reaction to the abandonment of South Stream. They were not pleased. Borisov really dearly wants to revise it. To revise Putin's decision, but there was not one statement in Bulgaria basically saying Russia owes it to Bulgaria to build South Stream, not one. In Serbia, Nikolic made precisely this statement. Russia owes it to Serbia to actually build South Stream, and that was a quite interesting kind of remark. Bulgarian politicians are past that. They kind of don't particularly expect that Russia owes them anything. I mean, you kind of describe us as traitors, fine, we've seen that before. You describe us as brothers, fine again, we've seen that before also. So there is far less passion in Bulgarian kind of Russian relations with all kind of this variation. And you could see the passions in Serbia even here, right now, on this table.
Thank you. And the final remark.
Just very brief. I don't think that Russia may wish what they want, but I don't think that in the case of Serbia, they have any influence or say on the Serbian government policy vis-à-vis NATO or EU. And I think that, you know, Russian iterations about what Serbia should not or should do are viewed by majority of the Serbian public as something which is not their business. And same goes for the, you know, for the suggestions coming from the other side on certain issues. That's why, you know, as Jelena has mentioned, Serbia was not a part of the Warsaw Pact, and we don't have that complex of being a member of that pact. And here comes this equidistance behavior, but in a very clear sense that Serbia wants to become a member of the European Union. The majority of the Serbian public wants it, and nothing can change this policy. Now it depends, of course, you know, you need two to tango. How quickly can the EU respond? How quickly can we adopt the reforms? But Russia, to be very clear, doesn't have a say in this one. We have, you know, the government that has almost 2/3 majority in parliament. We have the prime minister who enjoys 55–60% in the opinion polls, and he can take country wherever he wants to. First visit was to Berlin, and he stated very clearly that Germany is a partner #1 for his government. First visit in the region was Sarajevo. That was also a certain message, and I think that the things are very clear in the case of Serbia.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I've been very, very sternly reminded by the organizers that we do have to wrap up. And I know that LSE has very strict rules about, you know, cut-off times for events, because they might be using the same room for another event that might be coming up later on. So, but I do want to thank the panelists for a very stimulating and excellent set of talks and very thought-provoking discussions. And I'm sure these discussions will continue during dinner time. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to penalize those of you who did want to ask questions, because I also had lots of questions, but I have to sort of just cut myself. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
We're just going to do a very quick wrap-up, so if you want to remain seated, we're just going to finish up the event.
You know, you don't have to.
Sorry, it was like overtime, but it was a great
Well, thank you very much. As our previous chair mentioned, unfortunately, we're almost out of time. So we're just going to do a very brief wrap-up session with really some comments from my co-organizer, Dr. Othon Anastasakis, who's been making copious notes throughout the day. And he's just going to give some of his thoughts on the things that we've heard today. We actually hope to be able to put together a proper report on today's event. We'll be working on that in the next few weeks, and hopefully we would aim, I should imagine, to be able to put this online within the next month or so. But I'll hand the floor over to Othon now for his thoughts and comments on today's event.
Well, I had prepared a number of points, like 7 in number, And I all have them in my computer, because this is one also of our Oxford traditions. Whenever we have our workshops and conferences, we tend to wrap up in points. There is no to-do list here, and it's not about policy recommendations, because that has been a very, very rich conceptually, as well as discussing the actual reality in the relationship. We are preparing a report, as James just said, but for me, two were the main kind of points that I really take with me, and they've been throughout the whole seminar today. One is how these two narratives actually compete or engage with each other. We've got the normative narrative from the EU, which is the dominant paradigm, and then we've got this competitive narrative, we may call it strategic, which is much more crude economic or security related, and how the region actually engages with these two, what kind of conflicts you see in its political, security, economic, energy, or society domain. That is one point that has been across. And there's been also a second point as to how Russia engages with the region. I mean, it's not its immediate neighborhood, and we all know that where Russia is really concerned is where the Russian populations are, and that's where it really, really has to act. But what for me is especially important is that the Balkans, and I've seen this from our discussion today, is very important because it's the neighborhood of the neighborhood, and in that sense, we're able to understand better the international actorness of this new global actor that is Russia in this multi-dimensional and multilateral environment. So I'm not going to say anything more. I just want to say thank you to all our speakers, and I think it's been fascinating because all speeches were actually excellent, and we learned so many things from them. And I want to thank also James and Dimo, because you did a fabulous job. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Othon. Dimo, I think you wanted to just say one or two very, very brief comments.
I put them in the spirit of Yalta on the back of a napkin, but I have a very small percentage of the panel. I mean, thanks to everyone for coming. I think it was a fascinating, very interesting and thought-provoking session, and I think there's at least one more conference to go. I'll be writing the report, but equally, let me engage in some shameless self-promotion. I'm working on a book on the subject, and as I tend to joke, Mr. Putin is making his best to keep us in business. Not just me, but maybe lots of you in the audience. But thanks once more, and stay tuned to produce the report. There'll be a couple of blog pieces and more.
And so on a final note, I'll just echo the thanks to all the speakers for their fantastic contributions today, and thank you all very much for coming. Thank you. Have a good weekend.